Okay, we've only got about 10 minutes, but there's a lot of material on the table. Mike's forecast, Jacob's analysis of Europe, and Joe's proposals for monetary policy reform. So the floor is open. Who wants to shoot? Jessica, please introduce yourself and then fire away.
Jessica Einhorn, Dean of Science. Not my custom to go first, but there's an interesting question after you listen to all three members of the panel. Michael doesn't think, certainly clearly explained to us why, but doesn't seem to think that the financial crisis aspect of this changes the recovery in historical terms, and sees a V-type recovery coming naturally, and also thinks that forecasts beyond 18 months are worthless. And so it would be interesting to know what Michael's view is on a change in the Taylor rule to accommodate the special features of the situation we're in, and whether or not monetary policy would be different than the recovery aspects you described to us. And also to hear from Joseph whether you agree with the recovery that Michael is forecasting. That's my question.
Mike and Joe?
Thank you.
Well, some things you can forecast out more than 18 months. What I think is not useful is trying to forecast the real GDP growth rate out beyond about 18 months. You want to look at trend. If you have a substantial output gap, you may want to say, well, there's going to be a tendency for that to be eliminated over time. But near term, talking a year to 18 months, there can be things that will tell you that you want to deviate from that. So I thought in early 2009 that the fears of a depression were vastly overdone, that there had been a substantial shock from the crisis. It would likely be spent by around the middle of the year, and that we would then get a recovery that would surprise everybody on the upside. We're no longer in that initial stage of recovery, so I'm anticipating that the growth rate will be a little stronger than what we might normally expect, and the further out we look, it's project essentially trend. In terms of the unemployment rate, you know, in the Reagan expansion, which was substantially more vigorous in its initial stages than this one, it still took 6 years to get the unemployment rate down from 10.7 to 5.3%. So the unemployment rate in the United States is going to be up there for a considerable period of time. Where I disagree with Joe is I think monetary policy at this stage has done about as much as it reasonably should be expected to do, and I object to the use of thermonuclear weapons in Afghanistan. That is to say, there's a limit on how far you want to go in what circumstance in using your monetary policy instrument. The policy he proposes, you need to understand, would be enormously more aggressive in the use of monetary policy than anything we have seen in recent history, in terms of the magnitudes of the movements in the federal funds rate and the magnitude of the movements in the central bank's balance sheet. I'm extremely reluctant, when we haven't had experience with that, to say, well, this is the way to go. And the other way I describe this policy, I say, is, look, this is like Michael Jackson's physician. My patient's feeling a little down, I'll feed him a few uppers. Feeling a little up, I'll feed him a few downers. And you get in this business as a central bank of doing too much of that, and the outcome is not very felicitous. So I prefer a monetary policy which, at extreme circumstances such as we had in late 2008 and early 2009, does resort to extreme measures. But I see the situation in the United States now and going forward as not nearly as dire and threatening as it was 18 months ago. And accordingly, it seems to me having a monetary policy that is aggressively more expansionary than it was then does not make a great deal of sense. And if we followed a policy rule of that kind, I think we would soon find that we're producing much more instability than we are eliminating from the economy.
Joe, your response.
Well, Mike's right that this would be more aggressive monetary policy than we have ever seen in history, and I say that's what we want. We've had, history shows that you don't get good outcomes from these kind of crises, and you need stronger policy to counteract them. Now, I take Mike's caution very seriously that, you know, sky is not the limit. It's not like there's no limit to what can be done. Not that there's no framework in which this could be put into and thought about carefully. And indeed, I think there's a lot of work on exactly that. What should the optimal Taylor rule be? And like I said, most of it seems to imply that if you feel comfortable knowing that you are in an output gap and not close to it, the work says you should hit the economy harder be more aggressive. So, I think we got to put that in a framework that this is the problem, right? We're in uncharted territories, and we need to come up with measures that we can use that say, how much more aggressive should we be? So I think it's a serious concern, but I think it's a huge difference between now and 2002, 2001, when the unemployment rate never went more than 2 percentage points above what was probably the NAIRU. And I don't think you should take the biggest guns out in that scenario. And I think we probably overreacted then and certainly didn't tighten soon enough afterwards. So, you don't do this in ordinary small recessions.
Hi, Arturo Porsegansky with American University. Thank you for wonderful presentations. Many of us ignored at our peril the housing boom and the boom in mortgage-related assets. Might we be ignoring at our peril what the gold market is trying to tell us, what the dollar is trying to tell us, what other commodity markets are trying to tell us?
I don't worry very much about the gold market. It seems to me the price of gold can go up and down by substantial amounts without creating big problems. Housing is very different. We've had a lot of experience with housing booms and busts, not so much in the United States, but in lots of other countries. And when they're credit-driven, it's a mess to clean them up. So we're not regenerating a housing bubble right now. And I don't see the performance of the stock market or other markets as suggesting that a bubble is being generated at present. However, one of the concerns is that when the Fed expands its balance sheet enormously and it has its interest rate at zero, they're not going to instantaneously move back to a more normal stance of policy. So they're going to be stuck in this policy for a considerable period of time because they're going to be concerned that too early a withdrawal, too rapid a withdrawal is going to forestall the continued recovery. And that's indeed what these policy rules would suggest, because the policy rules pay no attention to asset prices at all. So we'd be out there pumping up the balance sheet as property prices go back to the sky. And I think that is a worry, as I say, not immediately, but it's a reason why you shouldn't say, well, the policy rule we've simulated in our mathematical model, our statistical model, and it looks safe. Yeah, well, I mean, the shuttle looks safe too, but 2 out of 5 of them blew up. And so one wants to be a little careful about going well outside the boundaries of what is normal policy performance and to conclude that is safe. I would note one other thing. As I understand Joe's argument, he's saying Paul Volcker was wrong and the Federal Reserve was wrong in 1984 when they retightened monetary policy as they saw the expansion proceeding more rapidly than they thought was sustainable because of a fear that inflation might resurge. It had not resurged, but they nevertheless, with the unemployment rate still above 7.5%, retightened monetary policy. I believe that action helped to prolong the long Reagan expansion. And if they had held back and had a very easy monetary policy because the unemployment rate was still very escalated, that we would have gotten back into a problem. And I think it's the history of the conduct of monetary policy and how it has been articulated which leads me to believe that the kind of rule that's being suggested is just way outside the boundaries of anything we've had experience with and needs to be viewed with utmost skepticism.
I would very tentatively, Arturo, offer another hypothesis for the run-up in the gold price, which is not something we normally think of as a bubble, but certainly is a problem. Practically every country in the world is now trying to depreciate its currency. We have a competitive undervaluation or devaluation race. It was led by the largest surplus and creditor country, China, paradoxically, who should be the least country moving in that direction. As Mike said in his remarks, we know the renminbi is substantially undervalued. Quite naturally, then, particularly at a period of global underutilization of capacity, that's spilling over to other countries. Many other surplus countries, Japan most recently, are also trying to weaken or at least avoid the strengthening of their currency. Then naturally, deficit countries are coming into the game, even if they have large reserves like Brazil. And even the biggest, the US and EU, are, if not actively seeking, at least quite happy to see their currencies weaken. If everybody's trying to weaken his currency, of course, it can't net out because one currency goes down, somebody's got to go back up. But if every country's trying to do it, you don't quite know where to run in terms of safe haven alternative currency, and that may explain part of the run into gold. Now, you could suggest other commodities as well, but gold has kind of this traditional element of that type, which could suggest that it becomes, by default, the safe haven in this environment. We're going to have other events here on this competitive devaluation race. It's a focus of our work here at the Institute. We worry about it a lot. It's not the topic for today, but I think it comes in that respect. I'm afraid we're at our witching hour of 2 o'clock. I want to thank very much Mike, Jacob, and Joe for their presentations. Thank all of you for coming, despite the inclement weather. It's great to see you. Meeting adjourned.